Hi, good morning. My name is Konrad Rybka, and thank you for joining for this talk, which is methodological in nature. In the first place, I want to share with you our experiences with using smartphones to work with our indigenous partners remotely, a solution that the corona pandemic forced us to adopt, and some of the results of our research. At the same time, I will discuss how the method helped us revisit our fieldwork practices, in particular the approach to ethnobotanical research, since the focus of the project is plant knowledge. To this end, I will start by introducing the different parties involved in the project and their goals. The focus of this project is Taruma, a language isolate of Guyana, presumed extinct since the 1950s, and therefore not marked on this and other language maps. Around this time, the Taruma people ceased to exist as a separate nation and joined the linguistically unrelated YY and Wapishan people. Taroma is also poorly documented. The only materials are a short word list by Farabi and a few pages of manuscript notes by the missionary Kari Elves. That said, there are still three Taroma speakers who live among the Wapishan in Turunao, a part of the Wapishan village called Maruranao. They are bilingual in Taruma and Wapishan, while their younger relatives speak Wapishan and English. The goal of the Taruma speakers was to start documenting their language and pass their knowledge to their relatives, who in their turn wanted to learn the language. The second language of the Taruma and the majority language of Maruranao is Wapishan, an Arawakan language that is still spoken by all generations but is threatened by English. Recognizing this threat, one of the aims of the Wapishan Literacy Association, a language-related organization of the Guyanese Wapishan, is to build capacity for creating Wapichan language digital content so that the Wapichan can benefit from what the digital world offers while fostering their language. The Wapichan involved in this project wanted to acquire skills useful to language-related work, such as digital and translation skills. The linguists involved in the project wanted, of course, to kick off the description of the language, Taruma, starting with its phonology. Our second goal was to study borrowing patterns in Taruma. There is historical evidence that the Taruma migrated from Brazil to Guyana in the 18th century, and we hope to find linguistic evidence of that, words shared with the languages of the Lower Negro. We focused on plants, both because it is a domain which the indigenous participants found interesting and because the botanical diversity of the region is still rather poorly documented. Our team includes Taruma and Wapishan speakers, linguists, and botanists. Because of Corona, we could not travel to Guyana for about a year and became split into what we call the on-site team in Maruranao and the off-site team in the Netherlands. And since there is a hotspot in Maruranao, we transferred money to Guyana so that the on-site team can buy a smartphone and cover the research costs to work with us remotely. I will explain now our workflow step by step. In short, the on-site team went out to identify plants they know, photograph them, record their names and uses as audio recordings, sort the data per plant, and send them off using WhatsApp to the off-site team. We chose WhatsApp because it was familiar to everyone and planned the activities in such a way as to foster language use and transmission. The on-site team focused on what is remembered and had therefore more control over what they want to share, which we thought of as one way to address the village's concerns about biopiracy. The on-site team worked in speaker-learner pairs so that the learners are present when identifying, naming, and describing the plants, thereby learning all about them. The pairs communicated with one another to learn from each other and to help the Taruma speakers refresh their knowledge. When making the recordings, the learners also repeated the names after the speakers to make the learning process explicit. And they also did the learners, they did the translation of the recordings via Wapishan into English, thereby improving their translation skills. And since everything was recorded, we could give them later feedback about their translations. A few months later, we also visited Maruranao to organize a translation workshop for the whole community and teach further digital translation-related skills such as transcribing and translating using Elan. Now, the off-site team used the photographs to identify the species and studied the recordings. It is worth noting that we received several rather short recordings per plant, And in order to be able to work with these files efficiently and make them useful to larger audiences later, we first concatenated them into longer files using a Python script and transcribed them in elan. Now, this kind of remote documentation is rather unheard of in botany, so let us look now at how botanists typically work and how the remote collaboration compares to that. Since around the 16th century, to identify plants, botanists collect plants, dry and press them to create physical vouchers. This standard procedure enables revisions of the proposed classifications and permits conducting other analyses using the genetic material. But the method comes with limitations. Some plants are difficult to preserve due to their physical characteristics, for instance, palms. Some cannot be removed because of their rarity or cultural significance. The method also requires intensive labor, considerable equipment, training, and permits, which made it impossible for us to use it in the context of this project. And from an audience perspective, the question is, how can a dried and pressed plant stored in an herbarium abroad be of any use to the speech community? And this is, of course, also a question that herbaria, museums, archives more generally ask themselves today more generally. And from an indigenous perspective, while physical vouchers are the cornerstone of empiricism in botany, they may not be within an indigenous system of knowledge that categorizes plants by features such as their color, texture, smell, and taste, all of which become transformed in the process of creating physical vouchers. Under certain circumstances, botanists collect photo vouchers. They photograph the plants instead of collecting them. What are the benefits? Photo vouchers permit recording a plant in its natural habitat and do not entail removing it. Digital photographs are easier and cheaper to store and share than physical vouchers. Today they can be created even with a smartphone. They can also include automatic GPS data, so you can create easily distribution maps of plants. As primary data, photo vouchers are visually richer than physical vouchers, and they're a humanly more appropriate representation of plants. But so far, this method is only used in the case of plants that cannot be collected, such as palms. Journals do not really accept research that is based on photo vouchers. Herbaria are still based on physical vouchers. You cannot create an entry without a physical vouchers. And of course, photo vouchers do not contain genetic material, which rules out further research on the sample. A fun fact is that today herbaria digitize their physical collections. That is, they photograph the dried plants and share them as such. This physical and photo voucher represent the same plant. You can decide for yourself which one does it better. But irrespective of the method, in botany, plants are compared visually to other material to establish their classification. While I pointed out earlier that there may be a mismatch between what counts as empirical in botany and in indigenous systems of knowledge, ethnobotany, a specific branch of botany, is interested in indigenous plant knowledge, not just plants. And two more things are worth pointing out. Indigenous criteria for identifying plants, a part of their knowledge, differ from those of botanists. The Taruma, for instance, cut the bark and to taste and smell it to identify trees. And this is actually captured in our photographs. In other words, photographs allow us to catch a glimpse of this knowledge and could be used to document it more systematically and empirically. Further, ethnobotany both looks at plants and listens to their indigenous names and uses. This is language data. Yet, as opposed to visual data, which are stored as primary data, either physical or photo vouchers, language data are shared as secondary data, perceptions of what was said during interviews, and translations of the uses, ultimately published in a major language for non-indigenous publics. Put simply, botanists do not collect and archive recordings, which creates the risk of misrepresenting indigenous knowledge, but also makes the data less useful to linguists. And it goes the other way too. If linguists don't collect vouchers, their data are less relevant to botanists and ethnobotanists. Returning to our project, our goal was to create a documentation that meets the empirical standards of botanical photo vouchers, which we believe represent plants better to people and are more in line with indigenous identification criteria and community needs, but which also put ethnobotany on a stronger empirical footing when it comes to auditory language data. One of our end products is therefore a Taruma and Wapishan plant guide, which is built of audiovisual vouchers. This is a name we coined, an example of which you see here. These contain, first of all the photographs taken by the team, which allow for the identification of the species, both by the indigenous people and botanists, but also plant products made from them, a description of the uses, which at this stage are still rather general, but now that we have finalized the format, we are expanding them and turning the document into a bilingual English and Wapishan publication. ID number, which links the guide back to, or each audiovisual voucher back to the original images, sound files, and ELAN files with more recordings about the plans stored in the community and now being archived with ELAR. Credits, identifying those who took pictures, who identified the indigenous taxa, and those who did a botanical classification, which meet the standards of both ethnobotany and linguistic documentation, and Taruma and Wapishan names of the plants in their orthographic and phonemic form, together with embedded sound. That's important. And finally, the botanical name of the species, GPS data, and date. Since one of our goals today is to add to the conversation about empiricism, in particular when it comes to the interface between botany and linguistics on the one hand and indigenous knowledge on the other hand, it merits to give a simple example of the value of primary language data in ethnobotanical research, and at the same time to highlight one of the major obstacles we encountered in remote research, that is translation. Consider this example, translated first by Nita, a Wapishan speaker, as the banana fruit, we drink it, and we also make wine of it. Nita omitted here the obvious, that the fruit is also eaten, but more information is lost since Wapishan verbs tend to be semantically more packed. Komokodoni does not mean drink, in fact, but to blend pulpy fruit or vegetable into a drink. It's a whole recipe in a verb. There is no simple one-word equivalent of this verb in English that Nita could have used that would specify the manner and object of the action. These translation mismatches are common in our documentation, but we could only see them because we have the recordings and could go back to the original and unpack it. Before we realized it, we were asking the on-site team questions like, but how do you make it? Not realizing that the answer is already there. Documenting this kind of knowledge without making recordings, botanists take an unnecessary risk of misrepresenting indigenous knowledge, but also making the data simply less useful to other sciences. Besides the plant guide we are working on, designed with researchers and community in mind, we hope to design the activities in such a way as to stimulate the participants to learn Taruma and improve translation skills as part of the project. It's hard to evaluate what effects this has had, but it's worth looking at the self-reported experiences of the on-site team. The speakers commented that the off-site team, so us, awakened us to speak our language, the names, the walk, the whole exercise. Right away, I remember my mother and the time she used to spend with us, which speaks to Vincent's remembering more of Taruma language. Vincent did not know certain names, so Nita came to me, and I was able to tell her, which speaks to the exchange of knowledge between the speaker-learner pairs. The learners commented that the project helped them to open up more to Wapishan, Taruma, and even English, that they learned more about Taruma, the names of plants in Taruma, names they did not know, but also to improve their writing skills in Wapishan and Taruma, and that they learned new plants, even new plants in Wapishan. This is Konaiki, a Wapishan participant, and improved their translation skills. Further, it's worth noting that the recordings increase in grammatical complexity from one-liners to whole texts, and we think of this as a kind of a language bootcamp experience which improved the quality of the documentation created later during fieldwork and inspired the on-site team to record their own materials, such as the history of their family. In evaluating the quality of the photo documentation, it merits to note that despite the floristic diversity of the area, the lack of physical vouchers, and prior training on the side of the on-site team, we identified remotely 57% of the taxa at the species level and 35% at the genus level. Identifying plant names that Taruma shares with other languages of the Lower Negro specifically, which could speak to past knowledge exchanges in that locale and indirectly to Taruma's migration into the Guyanas, was complicated by the fact that many languages of the Lower Negro are extremely poorly documented, and even for the languages of the Guyanas, the necessary comparative data are scant. There are, however, a few plants and plant-based products for which we do have names in all the relevant languages, and the comparison of which shows that they are cognate candidates in other language families, hence borrowings into Taruma. They could not have been borrowed from any language of the Guyanas, and have adequate source forms in the languages of the Taruma neighbors on the Lower Negro. Chiwi for Maritza flexuosa, most likely a borrowing from Bajuana, Cho'i for manioc bread, most likely a borrowing from Aruaki, and Kumata for manioc sifter, most likely a borrowing from Omagua, are key examples thereof. Summing up, I hope to have convinced you that remote ethnobotanical documentation can be designed in a way that fosters language use throughout the project, implies the creation of visual and auditory primary data, meets, if not elevates, the standards of linguistic and botanical documentation, produces output that is more attuned to how indigenous people perceive plants, is therefore more reusable by both other researchers and communities, and relevant to current academic discussions. I want to thank you for listening and open the floor for your questions. Thank you.